The arrow took the lead courier's horse in the throat, and Elias Bailey was already moving before the animal hit the ground, hauling the second rider off the saddle, and behind the overturned supply cart, a heartbeat before the next volley hissed through the mountain fog. "Stay down," he barked, pressing the wounded courier flat against the frozen mud of the switchback road. Above them, the walled town of Kest Hollow clung to its shelf of stone like a barnacle, its monastery bell already tolling alarm, and below them, spilling out of the tree line in a wave of dark leather and raised axes, came the raiders who had shattered 11 years of uneasy truce in a single bloody morning. Elias had no sword. He had a farrier's hammer, still looped through his belt from the morning's work shoeing the garrison's horses, and he gripped it now with both hands, more from instinct than any real hope it would save him. He was not a soldier. He had never pretended to be one. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders from a life bent over anvils and hooves, and until this moment his most dangerous encounter with an orc had been arguing over the price of nails at the trading post. That was before the war horn sounded from the ridge above the raiders, before the ground itself seemed to shudder, and before Mazoga Gorehorn came off the mountain like something poured down from the sky. She rode no horse. She did not need one. She came on foot, faster than any human sprinter, a great curved blade in each hand, her braided black hair whipping loose from its leather ties, and she hit the raider's flank like a landslide given purpose. Elias had heard stories of orc war leaders, the kind sung about in tavern songs meant to frighten children into behaving, but no song had prepared him for the sight of her tearing through 6 armed men in the time it took him to draw one full breath. She was clad in fitted battle leathers the color of old rust, laced tight from throat to waist and cinched at a narrow belt, the leggings molded to powerful thighs built for the kind of speed that should not have belonged to a woman her size. Twin blades, hip-height boots crusted with mountain snow, a torn cloak the deep green of her clan streaming from one shoulder. Her tusks caught the gray light when she roared, and her golden eyes found Elias across the chaos of the road, and for one impossible moment, in the middle of a battle that should have ended his life, she looked directly at him as if he were the only still point in a spinning world. Then a raider's axe came for her back, and she spun away, and the moment broke. Elias dragged the wounded courier the rest of the way behind the cart while the world screamed around them. He had heard, dimly, through years of gossip at the smithy and rumors passed along the wagon trail, that the truce between the mountain kingdoms and the Gorehorn clan had been signed by Mazoga's own mother, and that Mazoga herself had ridden as its enforcer for a decade, keeping the peace between two peoples who still, in their bones, distrusted one another. He had never expected to see her fight. He had never expected to see her at all, except perhaps at a distance, at some treaty gathering in the town square, surrounded by guards and dignitaries who would never let a common farrier get close. The battle did not last long. Whoever had ordered the ambush had not expected the Gorehorn warband to be riding escorts so near the border, and when Mazoga's warriors crested the ridge behind her, the raiders broke and scattered into the tree line, leaving 6 of their own dead on the frozen road and dragging their wounded with them. Mazoga stood in the aftermath, chest heaving, blood that was not her own darkening one sleeve, and she looked again toward the overturned cart, toward the man who had dragged a bleeding courier to safety with nothing but a hammer for a weapon. "You," she said, and her voice was low and rough as gravel dragged over stone, but there was something in it that was not quite a command. "Come out from behind there." Elias rose slowly, hammer still in hand, uncertain whether he was addressing a rescuer or a new kind of danger. Up close she was even more striking than she had seemed at a distance, her jaw strong, her skin a deep mossy green touched with old scars along one cheekbone, her eyes a shade of gold he had never seen on any creature, human or otherwise. She was easily his height, if not taller, and there was nothing soft about the way she carried herself, and yet when she looked at him, something in her stance eased just slightly, like a bowstring released from full draw. "You are the farrier," she said. It was not a question. The one who shoes the garrison horses. Elias Bailey, he said, because it seemed important to give his own name rather than simply be described. Yes, I shoe horses, among other things. You put yourself between that boy and the arrows, Mazoga said, tilting her head toward the wounded courier who was already being tended by two of her warriors. With a hammer. It was what I had. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile pulled at one corner of her mouth, quickly suppressed, as though laughter was a luxury she rarely permitted herself. It was enough, she said. Come, the Hollow will want to know why their supply road is running red. And I will want to know why my clan is being blamed for an ambush none of my people ordered. That was the beginning, though Elias would not understand until much later just how thoroughly his life had already changed in those few frantic minutes on the mountain road, or how much of the trouble to come would be carried, quite literally, on the broad and capable shoulders of Mazoga Gorehorn. Kest Hollow was not a large town, but it was an old one, built into the shoulder of the mountain by monks 3 centuries dead, its stone walls patched and repatched by generations of soldiers and masons, until the town looked less like a single structure, and more like something grown organically out of the rock itself. Narrow streets switchbacked between the outer wall and the central monastery keep, and every building leaned companionably against its neighbors, as if bracing against the wind that never quite stopped scouring down off the higher peaks. It was a garrison town, a trading town, and for the last 11 years, a truce town, the one place along the border where humans and orcs were permitted to walk the same market square without drawn steel, under terms brokered by the treaty that Mazoga's mother had signed with the blood of both peoples still fresh on the memory of the last war. Elias had lived there for 6 years, ever since a bad winter and a worse debt had driven him out of the lowland farms where he'd grown up and into the mountain garrison's employ. He was good with horses, better with hooves and nails and the delicate business of fitting iron to something that could kill you with a single kick if you misjudged its temper, and the garrison paid steadily even if it did not pay well. He kept to himself. He had never married. There had been a woman once, years before, who had decided a farrier's wages were not worth a farrier's company, and after that Elias had simply stopped looking, filling the empty hours with work and the company of horses, who at least never lied to him about what they wanted. He walked into town that afternoon at Mazoga's side, and he felt every eye in the market square swing toward them like weather vanes catching a sudden wind. They stare, Mazoga said, not quite quietly enough to spare him the awkwardness of it. They stare at you, Elias said. You are hard to miss. They stared before I arrived, she said, at you, walking beside me. He supposed that was true. A farrier in scorched leather apron, hammer still hooked to his belt, walking shoulder to shoulder with an orc war leader in bloodied battle leathers was not a common sight in Kest Hollow, truce or no truce. Old suspicions did not die simply because a treaty had been signed. They only went quiet waiting. The garrison commander, a heavy-set man named Captain Raynor Ashford who had never much liked the arrangement with the Gorehorn clan even when it kept the peace, met them at the gatehouse with his arms crossed and his mouth already set in a hard line. Mazoga, he said, giving her name none of the honorific the treaty technically required. I hear there was an ambush on the supply road. There was, she said. 6 dead, none of them mine, none of them yours, all of them wearing the black sashes of the Iron Wolf clan. They are not signatories to our truce. They mean to break it and blame both sides for the wreckage. Convenient, Ashford said, that you were riding escort so near the border when it happened. Mazoga's expression did not change, but something in the air around her seemed to sharpen, the way it did before a storm broke over the peaks. Say what you mean, Captain. I mean that some in this town wonder whether the Gorehorn clan staged this themselves, to remind us how much we still need your blades to keep the roads safe. A tidy little show of force, dressed up as rescue. Elias felt his own temper rise before he could stop it, surprising himself with the heat of it. "I was on that road," he said. "I watched her cut through 6 armed men to save a courier boy she had never met." "If that is a show, Captain, I would like to see what you call the truth." Ashford's eyes flicked to him, cold and assessing. "No one asked the farrier's opinion." "No one needed to," Mazoga said, and there was an edge in her voice now, "because he offered it freely, which is more honesty than I have had from this garrison in a month of treaty councils." She stepped closer to Ashford, close enough that the captain had to fight not to retreat. "Hear me clearly. My clan did not order that ambush. If you wish to accuse the Gorehorn of oath-breaking, bring proof to the council fire, not sour rumor whispered over your own fear. Until then, I will be riding this border with or without your gratitude, because I gave my word to keep it safe, and I do not break my word." She turned on her heel and walked away before Ashford could answer, and Elias, after a moment's hesitation, found himself following her rather than staying behind with the captain, a decision he would later understand as the first small step off the safe, familiar road he had walked his entire life. She did not go far, only to the edge of the market square where a low stone wall overlooked the terraced fields dropping away toward the river far below, silver and cold in the afternoon light. She stood there with her arms crossed, jaw tight, and Elias came to stand a respectful distance away, unsure whether she wanted company or solitude. "You did not have to speak for me," she said without turning. "I spoke the truth. It happened to be about you." That earned him a sideways glance, gold eyes narrowed but not unkind. "Most humans in this town would rather swallow their tongues than speak truth on my behalf, farrier. It is not a small thing you did back there." "Elias," he said. "My name is Elias, not farrier. Elias then." She said it slowly, testing the shape of it, and something about the way she spoke his name settled strangely warm in his chest, entirely out of proportion to the simple fact of being addressed correctly. "I am Mazoga Gorehorn, though I suspect you already knew that." "I'd heard the name," he admitted. "Never thought I'd be standing this close to it." "Disappointed?" "The opposite," he said before he'd quite decided to say it, and then felt his ears heat at his own boldness. Mazoga's mouth curved, that same suppressed almost smile from the road, a little less suppressed this time. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Elias Bailey," she said, speaking so plainly to an orc war leader with blood still drying on her sleeve. "Might be both," he said. "Wouldn't be the first time." She laughed then, a short surprised bark of sound that seemed to startle her as much as it did him. And for just a moment the fierce, guarded warrior standing at the edge of the wall looked almost young, almost unburdened, and Elias thought, with a lurch he did not examine too closely, that he would very much like to hear that sound again. The council fire that Mazoga had spoken of convened 3 nights later in the monastery's great hall, a vaulted stone chamber lit by iron braziers, and hung with the tattered banners of a dozen old campaigns, some human, some orc, relics of the war the truce had ended. Elias had no reason to attend, no formal standing in either camp, but Mazoga had asked him to be there, quietly, almost as an afterthought, as she and her warriors passed through the smithy yard where he'd been shoeing a nervous gray mare. "Why me?" he'd asked, genuinely baffled. "I'm no diplomat. I barely have standing to speak at a town meeting about the price of grain." "Because you were on that road," she said, "and because you did not flinch from telling Ashford the truth to his face. I would have another honest tongue in that hall besides my own. There will be precious few of them." So he came, standing near the back of the crowded hall among the garrison soldiers and town elders, watching as Captain Ashford presented his suspicions to the assembled council, watching as Mazoga stood before them all in her battle leathers, unbowed, her warriors flanking her at a respectful distance, and watching as the argument grew louder and uglier by the minute, old grievances dragged back into the light like corpses exhumed from a shallow grave. "Every truce your clan has signed with this valley has ended the same way," said one of the town elders, a thin, sharp-faced man named Corwin who had lost a brother in the old war. "In blood, Why should this time be different? Because I signed it, Mazoga said, and I do not break my word. If you doubt the honor of my clan, doubt me specifically and say so to my face, not behind the shield of a council table. Very well, Corwin said, standing. I doubt you. I doubt that any orc, however finely you dress your savagery in treaty language, would not seize the first excuse to spill human blood in this valley again. The hall went very still. Elias felt his own pulse pounding in his throat, half expecting Mazoga to draw steel right there in the great hall, treaty or no treaty, provocation like that all but demanding blood answer for insult. Instead, she stood very straight, very calm, and something in her stillness was more frightening than any show of rage could have been. You want proof of my honor, she said, proof that outweighs 11 years of kept peace, proof heavier than blood. She paused, and her gaze swept the hall, and then, for reasons Elias would spend the rest of that night trying to understand, her eyes found his across the crowded chamber and held there. Then I will give you proof no one in this hall can dismiss as mere words. I will bind myself to this valley in a way even the most stubborn of you cannot deny. What does that mean? Ashford demanded. It means, Mazoga said, that I intend to take a husband from among your own people, a human husband chosen freely, bound by orc right before witnesses, so that my blood and my honor are tied to this valley beyond any treaty parchment that could be burned or disputed. Let any who still doubt the Gorehorn word explain to me how I could betray a truce that runs, from that day forward, through my own marriage bed. The hall erupted. Elias barely heard any of it, his ears ringing with something between shock and disbelief, because Mazoga's gaze had not left his face, not once, through the entire declaration, and though she had not spoken his name, though she had given the council no name at all, he understood with sudden, dizzying certainty exactly who she meant. It should have been impossible. It should have been, by any reasonable measure, absurd. And yet when the shouting finally quieted enough for Corwin to demand, red-faced, which unfortunate soul she intended to burden with such a marriage, Mazoga Gorehorn crossed the length of that stone hall, past soldiers and elders and her own startled warriors, and stopped directly in front of Elias Bailey, so close he could smell wood smoke and cold iron on her leathers. Him, she said, if he will have me. The whole hall turned to look at him, and Elias Bailey, farrier of Kest Hollow, a man who had spent 6 years being politely invisible to everyone but the horses in his care, found himself standing at the center of a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Why me? He asked because it was the only question that mattered, the only one he could force past the tightness in his throat. Mazoga's golden eyes did not waver. Because on that road you put a hammer between an arrow and a stranger's life without waiting to be asked whether it was your fight. Because you spoke truth to your own captain when it would have been safer to stay silent. Because when I looked at you, farrier, I did not see a man who feared me. I saw a man who simply looked back. She lowered her voice, though the whole hall still strained to hear it. I have led warriors and buried friends and kept a peace no one believed could last 11 years. I am tired, Elias Bailey, of being feared or used. I would like for once to be chosen, and I find that I would like to choose someone in return. It was, Elias would think later, the single most terrifying and most wonderful moment of his entire life, standing in that fire-lit hall with every eye in the valley on him, an orc war leader's hand extended toward him in a silence that seemed to stretch the length of a season. He took her hand. The hall did not erupt into cheers, not that night. It erupted instead into chaos, argument, half the elders shouting that this was some manner of trick, that no true marriage could bind an entire clan's honor, and the other half simply too stunned to speak at all. But Elias did not let go of her hand, and Mazoga did not let go of his, and whatever came next they would face it together, a fact that settled into Elias' chest that night with the strange, frightening warmth of a fire lit somewhere he had not known was cold until the flame caught. The days that followed were a blur of arrangement and argument, the town of Kest Hollow splitting along old fault lines that the treaty had only ever papered over rather than truly healed. Captain Ashford called it a scheme, a clever manipulation designed to embarrass the garrison and force concessions from the council. Corwin called it worse things, in language sharp enough that Mazoga's warriors had to be physically restrained from answering insult with steel. But the treaty itself, old and carefully worded as it was, held one clause no one had ever expected to matter. Any Gorehorn clan member who bound themselves by marriage right to a valley resident would carry the full weight of clan honor into that union, making any betrayal of the marriage equivalent, under Old Orc law, to betrayal of the clan itself. It was an old clause, meant originally to prevent exactly the kind of ambiguous loyalty crisis that had sparked the last war, and no one, in 11 years, had ever thought to invoke it. Mazoga had thought of it in the space of a single furious heartbeat, standing in that hall listening to Corwin question her honor, and she told Elias as much 3 days later, sitting across from him at the long wooden table in his own small smithy house. The only private space either of them had access to that was not crawling with soldiers or council elders eager for a piece of the scandal. "I did not plan it before that night," she admitted, turning a clay cup of spiced wine between her broad hands without drinking from it. "I had no husband in mind. I did not even know, until the words left my mouth, that I meant you specifically." "That's a comforting thing to hear," Elias said dryly, "from the woman I'm apparently marrying. Would you rather I lied and said I had admired you from afar for years, composing verses about your hammer arm? I'd rather know I'm not the punchline to a very elaborate joke." Mazoga set the cup down and looked at him directly, and the humor drained out of her expression, replaced by something more careful, more exposed. "You are not a joke to me, Elias. I will not pretend the timing was anything but reckless, but the choice itself was not reckless at all. I have watched you for 3 days now since the road. I have watched you shoe horses too frightened to stand still for lesser men, gentle as a mother with a colt. I have watched you speak plainly to men with more power than you, unafraid of the cost. I did not choose a stranger to make my point to that hall. I chose the one man in this valley I had already begun, foolishly, to admire." Elias sat very still, absorbing that, feeling the weight of it settle into him like sun-warmed stone. "You could have chosen anyone," he said quietly. "Any man in this valley would have said yes to you, Mazoga, treaty or no treaty. He gestured vaguely, helplessly at all of her, the sheer overwhelming fact of her. "You could have your pick of warriors twice my size, sons of lords, men with land and titles. I do not want a man twice your size," she said. "I have fought beside men twice your size. Most of them could not tell truth from flattery if their lives depended on it, which, in my experience, it often did. I want a man who will look me in the eye and tell me when I am wrong. I want a man who does not flinch." She reached across the table, and her fingers, calloused and strong, wrapped around his hand, the same way they had in the great hall, except now there was no crowd watching, no treaty at stake, only the two of them in the dim lamplight of his small kitchen. "I chose you, Elias Bailey, because I wanted to. Nothing more complicated than that and nothing less." He turned his hand in hers, so their palms pressed together, and felt something in his chest crack open that he had kept carefully sealed for 6 long, solitary years. "Then I suppose," he said, "we'd better figure out how a farrier marries an orc war leader without getting either of us killed by an angry mob first." Mazoga laughed, that same startled, delighted bark of sound, and leaned across the table and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. There was nothing gentle in the way she moved, the sudden hunger of it, her hand coming up to cradle his jaw with a strength that could have crushed stone, and instead held him with exquisite, deliberate care. Elias made a low sound against her mouth and kissed her back with everything 6 years of loneliness had been saving up without his knowledge, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mazoga's forehead rested against his, her golden eyes half-lidded, her voice rough. "I have wanted to do that," she admitted, "since the road." "You hid it well." "I am very good at hiding things," she said. It is a useful skill for a war leader. I find I do not wish to hide this one. The wedding, such as it was, would not follow any tradition either side entirely recognized, a fact that caused no small amount of consternation among the monastery's aging clerics and the Gorehorn clan's own elders, several of whom had ridden down from the high camps once word of Mazoga's declaration reached them. There was a week of tense negotiation over rite and ritual, a week in which Elias barely saw Mazoga at all. Both of them pulled in different directions by people with strong opinions about how such an unprecedented union ought to be conducted. He shod horses in the day and lay awake at night turning the whole impossible situation over in his mind, half convinced he would wake to find it had all been some fevered dream, and half terrified that it would not be, that he really was about to marry a woman so far above his station that the mere fact of her choosing him still felt, some mornings, like a mistake waiting to be corrected. It was Mazoga herself who finally cut through the tangle of arrangement and argument, arriving unannounced at his smithy one evening with her clan elder's compromise already decided. "We will do it by the river," she said, without preamble, settling onto the bench beside his forge as though she had every right to be there, which, he supposed, she now did. Below the town, where the water runs fast enough to carry things away, human custom says a bride carries flowers. Orc custom says a bride carries nothing into a new life that was not chosen freely, that all old bonds must be released before new ones are made. We will do both. I will carry your human flowers to the water's edge, and then release them to the river, as my people release the old life and reach for you instead, as my people take a mate. Let both traditions be honored, and let neither elder complain that I ignored their customs entirely." Elias, sitting across from her with a half-finished horseshoe cooling forgotten in his hand, found himself smiling despite the exhaustion of the past week. "You've thought this through." "I have had very little else to think about," she said, "besides you, and the fact that half this valley still believes I mean to slit your throat on our wedding night as some manner of clan initiation. Do you?" "Only if you snore," she said, and the flat seriousness of her delivery startled a laugh out of him before he caught the glint of humor in her eyes. The morning of the wedding came clear and cold, the kind of high mountain morning where the sky seemed impossibly close, close enough to touch, and the whole valley smelled of pine smoke and frost. Word had spread through Kest Hollow and the surrounding camps alike, and by the time Elias made his way down the switchback path to the riverbank, dressed in the one good coat he owned, dark wool with silver buttons his mother had left him, he found the banks already crowded with onlookers, human and orc alike, standing in wary, separated clusters that had never before, in living memory, gathered for the same occasion. Captain Ashford stood near the garrison contingent, arms crossed, face unreadable. Corwin was absent entirely. Having declared the whole affair an offense against decency, he could not bring himself to witness. But there were others, more than Elias had expected, townsfolk who had known him for years, who came not out of any grand belief in orc-human unity, but simply because they had watched Elias Bailey shoe their horses and mend their plows for 6 patient, unremarkable years, and found they could not, in the end, begrudge him whatever strange happiness had found him. Mazoga's clan elders stood on the opposite bank in their own wary cluster, faces carved from suspicion and old grief, but among them Elias spotted several of the warriors who had ridden with Mazoga on the day of the ambush, and their expressions, at least, held something closer to respect than doubt. The river ran fast and silver below the gathered crowd, snowmelt swollen, and loud enough that the officiating cleric, an old monk named Brother Aldous who had somehow been convinced to conduct the human half of the ceremony, had to raise his voice to be heard over the water's rush. Then Mazoga arrived, and every conversation on both banks died at once. She had traded her battle leathers for a different set entirely, still fitted, still unmistakably her own. A bridal version cut from deep green hide the color of her clan's cloak, laced tight at the waist and throat, embroidered along the bodice with pale thread in old orc knotwork that Elias would later learn represented oaths kept across generations. Her hair was unbound for once, black and glossy, falling loose past her shoulders, and in her hand she carried a bouquet of white mountain lilies that someone, likely one of the town's few remaining florists, had assembled at Elias' own quiet request, because he had wanted her to have at least one thing from his world in her hands on this day, even if the rest of it belonged entirely to a tradition he did not yet fully understand. She walked down the bank toward him with her chin high and her golden eyes fixed on his, and Elias thought, watching her come, that he had never in his life seen anything so fiercely, terrifyingly beautiful, and that he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of the fact that she was walking toward him and not away. Brother Aldous cleared his throat and began the human portion of the rite, words about union and duty and the sight of the gods, and Elias heard perhaps one word in three, too consumed with the sight of Mazoga standing across from him, close enough now that he could see the fine scars along her jaw, the slight nervous tension in her shoulders that no one else in the crowd would likely have noticed, because he was already, in the space of a few short days, learning the language of her. When Brother Aldous finished, an expectant hush fell over both banks, and Mazoga stepped forward to the very edge of the rushing water, the bouquet still clutched in both hands. "My people say," she announced, her voice pitched to carry over the river's roar, addressing not just Elias but the whole assembled crowd, human and orc alike, that a bride who takes a new mate must first release what came before. Every old grievance, every old fear, every doubt that says this joining cannot hold. Her gaze swept the crowd, lingering pointedly on Ashford, on the clan elders, on every doubting face gathered on both banks. "I release them all here to this river, and I ask this valley to do the same." Then, with a motion far more deliberate and forceful than any simple ceremonial gesture required, she drew back her arm and hurled the bouquet of white lilies out over the rushing water, farther than seemed possible, the pale flowers scattering apart midair before vanishing into the current, carried instantly and irretrievably downstream, gone in the space of a single gasped breath from the crowd. It was not the gentle, symbolic toss of a human bride tossing her bouquet to a cluster of hopeful maidens. It was a warrior's throw, full-armed and absolute, a declaration that whatever doubt or grievance the river swallowed was never coming back, not for her, not for anyone. Then she turned back to Elias, and before he could fully process what he had just witnessed, before the crowd's stunned murmur had even finished rippling outward across both banks, Mazoga Gorehorn extended her hand toward him, palm up, exactly as she had in the great hall, exactly as she had at his own kitchen table, and said, loud enough for every doubting soul present to hear clearly, "I choose him, not the clan's honor, not the treaty, him, Elias Bailey, farrier of Kest Hollow. Reach back if you choose me too." The whole gathered crowd seemed to hold its breath at once, and Elias understood with sudden clarity that this moment was not merely ceremony. It was a test laid bare for everyone to see, a final irrevocable choice offered in front of witnesses who could never afterward claim ignorance of what had passed between them, and it was his to answer, fully, publicly, without hesitation, or not at all. He did not hesitate. He crossed the last few feet between them and took her offered hand in both of his, and the crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in stunned murmurs, some in outright dismay. But none of it mattered to Elias in that moment, not with Mazoga's fingers curling tight around his, not with her golden eyes bright and fierce, and for the first time since he'd met her, entirely unguarded. "I reach back," he said, loud enough for the whole valley to hear. "I choose you too, Mazoga Gorehorn, however this valley feels about it." She pulled him close and kissed him there on the riverbank in front of both their peoples, a kiss that tasted of cold mountain air and impossible joy, and somewhere downstream, unseen, the scattered white lilies rode the current out toward the lowlands, carrying with them whatever doubt either of them had once carried into that morning. They did not have long to enjoy the moment. 3 nights after the wedding, while Elias and Mazoga were still settling into the small stone house near the garrison stables that the town council had, with considerable grumbling, agreed to let them share, the watch bell atop the monastery tower began to ring in the frantic, uneven pattern that meant only one thing: attack. Elias was out of bed and reaching for his boots before he was even fully awake, old habits from 6 years of garrison life taking over, but Mazoga was already at the window, blades in hand, scanning the darkened street below with the coiled stillness of a predator assessing threat. "Riders," she said, "coming up the switchback road from the south. Black sashes." "Iron Wolf," Elias said, remembering the raiders from the ambush, remembering the 6 dead bodies left on the frozen road, remembering that whoever had ordered that attack had never been caught or answered for. "They mean to finish what they started," Mazoga said grimly, already moving toward the door. "And I suspect they mean to make an example of this marriage while they do it. A clan traitor's husband makes for a fine hostage, in the eyes of men who want to prove a treaty is worthless." "Then I'm coming with you." She turned, and for just a moment the fierce warrior mask slipped, replaced by something rawer, more frightened than he had ever seen her look, even in the chaos of the ambush. "Elias, you have a hammer and no armor. I cannot protect you and fight at the same time, not against a raiding party." "I'm not asking you to protect me," he said, pulling on his boots, grabbing the same hammer he'd carried onto that mountain road the day they met. "I'm asking to stand beside you. There's a difference, Mazoga, and you know it, because it's the exact reason you married me instead of some lord's son who'd have hidden in the cellar and let you handle it alone." Something in her expression cracked open, fierce and tender all at once, and she crossed the room and kissed him hard, fast, a promise more than an indulgence. "Stay close to me," she said. "And if I tell you to run, you run, understood? I did not throw my bouquet in that river to become a widow 3 nights into my marriage." The town was already in chaos by the time they reached the outer wall, garrison soldiers scrambling to man the gate towers, townsfolk hurrying children and livestock toward the monastery's thick stone walls, and beyond the gate, torchlight moving in a long, ominous line up the switchback road, far more riders than had attacked the supply cart days before. Captain Ashford met them at the gate tower stairs, his earlier suspicion of Mazoga apparently drowned entirely beneath the more immediate crisis of an actual siege. "Iron Wolf raiders," he confirmed. "Scouts count near 60 riders. We've got maybe 40 able bodies on this wall, counting your warriors, Mazoga, and we owe you an apology we don't have time to give properly." "Save it," Mazoga said, already scanning the wall's defenses with a professional eye. "How many archers?" 12. "Fewer arrows than I'd like. My warriors carry javelins and axes better suited to close work, but we have some bows among us." She turned to Elias. "The forge, your forge and every other forge in this town. We need iron caltrops scattered on the switchback approach, and we need it within the hour, before their main force reaches the narrow stretch below the second wall." Elias understood immediately. It was not glorious work, not the kind of thing songs got written about, but it was exactly the kind of work he knew better than almost anyone in Kest Hollow. "I can do that. I'll need hands and every scrap of iron in the smithy district." "Take them," Ashford said. "Whatever you need, farrier. Tonight you outrank half my garrison." For the next hour, Elias worked faster than he ever had in his life, coordinating a chain of blacksmiths, stable hands, and terrified but willing townsfolk into a makeshift production line, bending and twisting scrap iron into crude 4-pointed caltrops by forge light, while runners carried them out to the narrow switchback stretch below the wall and scattered them across the frozen road under cover of darkness. It was brutal, repetitive, unglamorous work, and it was, in its own way, exactly the kind of quiet competence that had first drawn Mazoga's eye to him on the road days before, the steady certainty of a man who did what needed doing without waiting to be told it mattered. By the time the Iron Wolf raiders reached the narrow stretch, their horses screaming and stumbling on the hidden iron, Their charge broke apart into chaos exactly where the town's defenders wanted it, funneled into range of Mazoga's archers and her warriors' javelins. Elias watched from the wall, hammer forgotten at his side, as Mazoga led a countercharge through the gate at the critical moment, cutting into the raiders' disorganized flank with the same terrifying speed he'd witnessed on the mountain road, except now, watching her fight to defend a town that had, until recently, doubted her honor, he understood something he had not fully grasped before. She was not simply a fearsome warrior. She was, in her own fierce way, exactly the kind of protector this valley desperately needed, and had never fully deserved. The battle lasted less than an hour, the raiders breaking and fleeing back down the mountain once their initial charge collapsed into iron-strewn chaos. But in the confusion of the retreat, Elias saw something that stopped his heart cold. 3 raiders, cut off from their retreating fellows, turned instead toward the gate tower stairs, toward the exact position where Elias himself stood directing the last of the Caltrip teams. And Mazoga, locked in combat 20 yards away, did not see them coming. He had no sword. He had never had a sword. He had a hammer, the same hammer he'd carried onto the mountain road the day they met. And when the first raider came up the stairs swinging a short axe toward the terrified stable boy cowering behind Elias swung the hammer with everything 6 years of forge work had built into his arms and shoulders, catching the axe blade at an angle that shattered the raider's grip and sent the weapon spinning off into the dark. The second raider came at him directly, and Elias, acting on instinct rather than any training, ducked low and drove the hammer's head up into the man's jaw with brutal, unpracticed force, and the raider went down and did not get up. The third raider, seeing his companions fall to a man with nothing but a farrier's tool, hesitated just long enough for Mazoga to notice the commotion at the gate tower. And what happened next would become, in the retelling around Kest Hollow's fires for years afterward, the second great legend of that night, second only to the story of the bouquet thrown into the river. Mazoga Gorehorn crossed 20 yards of battlefield faster than any human eye could properly track, and put her blade through the last raider before he had even fully raised his weapon toward Elias. And then, without pause, without any regard for the soldiers and townsfolk still watching from the wall, she pulled Elias into her arms so fiercely he nearly lost his footing, checking him for wounds with hands that trembled just slightly, for the first time since he'd known her. "You are unhurt," she said, more statement than question, as though she needed to hear it confirmed by her own voice before she could believe it. "I'm fine," Elias said, still catching his breath, hammer hanging loose and bloodied at his side. "Mazoga, I'm fine. You fought them off with a hammer again." Something between disbelief and fierce, overwhelming pride broke across her face. "I told you to stay close to me." "I did," he said. "You just happened to be busy elsewhere." She laughed, unsteady, and kissed him there on the gate tower stairs in front of the entire garrison, in front of townsfolk who, an hour earlier, had still whispered doubts about the wisdom of her marriage. And none of them, watching the two of them cling to each other amid the wreckage of a battle that had nearly cost them everything, doubted any longer exactly what Mazoga Gorehorn had meant when she said she had chosen this man freely, and would defend that choice with everything she had. In the days that followed the failed Iron Wolf raid, the true shape of the broken truce became clear. Scouts sent out by both the garrison and Mazoga's clan traced the raiders' retreat back to a hidden camp deep in the disputed foothills, and captured stragglers, under careful questioning, revealed that the Iron Wolf clan had been paid, in stolen garrison silver, to strike the supply road, and stir exactly the kind of mutual suspicion between humans and the Gorehorn clan that had nearly succeeded in unraveling 11 years of hard-won peace. The silver, it turned out, had been quietly siphoned from garrison coffers by men loyal to Corwin's faction of council elders, men who believed that renewed war with the Gorehorn clan, however costly, would be preferable to a truce that required treating orcs as equals under the law. When the evidence was laid before the full council, Corwin himself fled the valley rather than face judgment, and Captain Ashford, to his credit, stood before the assembled town and formally apologized to Mazoga, acknowledging that his own suspicion had nearly cost them the alliance that had, in the end, saved Kest Hollow from a war neither side could afford. It was not a grand reconciliation, not the kind that erased 11 years of mutual distrust in a single speech, but it was honest, and it was enough, and in the months that followed, the wary distance between the human quarter and the Gorehorn clan's border camps began, slowly, to narrow. For Elias and Mazoga, the weeks after the raid brought a different kind of adjustment, the quieter, more intimate work of two people learning to build a life together after having been thrown into marriage by crisis rather than courtship. It was not always easy. Mazoga had spent a decade as a war leader, accustomed to command, accustomed to solitude, and she did not always know how to simply exist beside another person without some crisis demanding her attention. Elias, for his part, had spent 6 years alone by habit rather than choice, and found himself, more than once, retreating into silence out of old instinct rather than any real desire for distance, and it took Mazoga's blunt, patient insistence, more than once, to draw him back out. "You go quiet," she told him one evening, several weeks after the raid, as they sat together on the low bench outside their small stone house, watching the sun set gold and pink over the western ridgeline. "When something troubles you, you go quiet instead of speaking it." "Old habit," Elias admitted. Nobody much wanted to hear a farrier's troubles before. "I am not nobody," Mazoga said, "and I very much want to hear them. That is what marriage means, Elias, at least by my people's understanding of it. Not just standing beside me on a battlefield. Sitting beside me on a quiet evening, telling me what weighs on you, even when there is no crisis demanding it." He was quiet a moment longer, but not this time out of avoidance. "I keep waiting," he admitted finally, "for you to realize you made a mistake, choosing me. Some mornings I wake up and I still can't quite believe it's real, and I think any day now she's going to look at me and wonder what she was thinking." Mazoga turned toward him fully, and the look on her face was not amused, not indulgent, but fierce and a little wounded, as though the confession had cost him something she took personally. "I have led warriors into battles I was not certain we would survive," she said. "I have buried friends. I have signed my name to a treaty that half my own clan believed was a betrayal of everything we had ever fought for. I do not make choices lightly, Elias Bailey, and I have never once, not for a single moment since that day on the mountain road, regretted choosing you." She took his hand, turned it palm up, traced the calluses there with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "You ask me why I chose you, as if the answer were some mystery I have not already told you plainly. I chose you because you are steady where other men are loud. I chose you because you do not need to prove yourself with a sword to prove your worth. I chose you because when I looked at you on that road, covered in another man's blood you had spilled trying to save a stranger, I saw a man I could build a life beside, and I have not once in all the weeks since seen anything to make me doubt that. Stop waiting for me to leave, Elias. I am not going anywhere." He did not have words equal to what he felt in that moment, so instead he simply pulled her close and kissed her, slow and unhurried, no crisis pressing at them, no battle at their backs, just the two of them on a quiet bench as the sun went down. And it was, he thought, the first time since the wedding that he had truly believed, all the way down to his bones, that this impossible marriage was not some fortunate accident about to be corrected, but a life he had genuinely, irrevocably earned. That night marked something of a turning point in their marriage, the first evening where the ease between them outweighed the uncertainty, and in the weeks that followed, that ease deepened into something Elias had never before experienced with another person. A partnership, equal and complete, in which neither the fierce orc war leader nor the quiet human farrier had to diminish themselves to fit beside the other. Mazoga continued her work maintaining the border truce, riding patrols along the mountain roads, mediating disputes between clan camps and human settlements that had, for 11 years, mostly avoided speaking to one another at all. But increasingly, Elias rode with her, not as a soldier, for he never did become much of a fighter beyond the desperate improvisation of that one violent night, but as something the border had never quite had before, a bridge. He shod horses for both the garrison cavalry and the Gorehorn clan's mounts, the first farrier in living memory trusted by both sides, and slowly, through the unglamorous daily work of iron and hoof and patient conversation, he became known throughout the valley not merely as Mazoga Gorehorn's husband, but as a man in his own right, respected on both sides of a border that had once seemed impossibly wide. There were still hard days. Not every soldier in the garrison came around to accepting the marriage, and not every orc elder in the mountain camps forgave Mazoga for choosing a human husband, instead of strengthening some existing clan alliance through more traditional means. There was one particularly difficult afternoon in early summer, a confrontation at the border market when a young orc warrior, newly arrived from a distant camp and unaware of the full history behind the marriage, openly challenged Mazoga's honor, calling her a traitor to her blood for binding herself to a human farrier rather than a warrior of her own people. Elias, standing beside her at the market stall where they had been buying grain for the winter stores, felt Mazoga's whole body go rigid beside him and braced himself for violence. But Mazoga did not draw steel. Instead, she stepped forward, calm and deliberate, and addressed the young warrior in a voice that carried across the crowded market square. "You call me traitor," she said, "for choosing love over convenience. Tell me, warrior, when you have stood on a battlefield and watched a man with no weapon but a blacksmith's hammer put himself between an arrow and a stranger's life, without waiting to be asked whether it was his fight, without any hope of reward, purely because it was the right thing to do, tell me then whether you still believe honor belongs only to those born with tusks and green skin." She gestured to Elias, standing quietly at her side. "This man has bled for this valley. He has stood beside me in battle, with nothing but iron and courage. If that is not honor by whatever measure your camp still uses, then I have learned nothing worth learning in all my years leading warriors, and I invite you to say so, plainly to my face, rather than muttering insult behind my back." The young warrior, faced with the full weight of Mazoga's fierce composure and the assembled crowd's obvious sympathy, backed down, muttering a grudging apology before retreating from the market square entirely. Elias, watching the whole exchange, felt something settle warmly in his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat, the quiet, profound certainty that Mazoga would defend him, always, without hesitation in front of anyone, exactly as fiercely as she expected him to stand beside her. "You didn't have to do that," he told her later as they walked home through the terraced fields, sacks of grain balanced across their shoulders. "I did," Mazoga said simply. "You are my husband, Elias. I will not stand silent while some green-blooded pup with more pride than sense questions your worth. Not now, not ever. That is not the woman I intend to be for you." He reached over and took her free hand, and she let him, and they walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, the kind that no longer needed filling. Autumn came to the mountains early that year, painting the high slopes gold and rust before the first heavy snows began to threaten the passes, and it was in the deepening chill of that season that Elias and Mazoga faced what would prove to be the last real test of their marriage. Not a battle, not a political crisis, but something far more personal. A message arrived at Kest Hollow carried by a Gorehorn clan runner, summoning Mazoga back to the high camps for a full council of clan elders, the first such gathering since her marriage, where the elders intended to formally decide whether her union with a human farrier would be recognized as legitimate under the deepest, oldest clan law, or dissolved as an aberration that threatened the clan's bloodline traditions. It was, Mazoga explained grimly, an authority even she could not simply ignore or override, older and more binding than any treaty she herself had signed. What happens, Elias asked carefully, if they refuse to recognize it? Mazoga's jaw tightened. Then by clan law I would be expected to set the marriage aside, or else be cast out from the Gorehorn clan entirely, stripped of rank, of kinship, of everything I have built across 2 decades of service. She looked at him, and there was real fear in her golden eyes, fear he had rarely seen from her even in the heat of battle. I would not blame you if you asked me to fight this differently, to find some way to spare myself that cost. Would you set the marriage aside? Elias asked quietly, needing to know, needing to hear it directly from her rather than assume. No, she said, without a single moment's hesitation, fierce and immediate. I would rather be cast out from every clan camp in these mountains than set you aside, Elias Bailey. But I did not want to make that choice for you without telling you plainly what it might cost us both. He crossed the small distance between them and took her face in both his hands, the way she had once taken his on their wedding night, and held her gaze steadily. Then we go together, he said. Whatever they decide. You didn't marry me alone on that riverbank, Mazoga. You married me for whatever comes next, good or hard. I'm not letting you walk into that council fire without me standing beside you, same as I did the first time. The journey up to the high camps took 3 days along mountain trails Elias had never before traveled, switchbacking ever higher into thinning air and colder wind, past ancient stands of dark pine and finally into the wide, hidden valley, where the Gorehorn clan had made their seasonal camp for generations. A sprawling arrangement of hide tents and cook fires nestled against a sheer granite wall, banners of deep green snapping in the wind above the largest tent, where the clan's eldest members waited. The council fire, when it convened on their second evening in camp, was a far more intimidating affair than the human council hall back in Kest Hollow, presided over by 5 ancient orc elders whose combined age, Elias suspected, likely exceeded 2 centuries, their weathered faces unreadable in the firelight as Mazoga stood before them and made her case, plainly and without apology, for the legitimacy of her marriage. I did not choose this man to spite our traditions, she told the assembled elders, Elias standing quietly at her side, doing his best not to visibly tremble under the weight of so many ancient, assessing stares. I chose him because he has proven, in blood and in patience, exactly the qualities our own laws claim to honor above all others: courage without cruelty, loyalty without demand for glory, steadiness that does not waver even when the cost is high. If our traditions cannot recognize honor simply because it wears a human face, then I question whether those traditions still serve the clan they claim to protect. The eldest of the elders, a stooped woman named Vashka whose face bore more scars than Mazoga's twice over, studied Elias for a long, uncomfortable silence before finally speaking. You, she said, addressing him directly for the first time. Farrier, why do you want this marriage? Speak honestly, human, for we will know if you lie. Elias swallowed hard and answered as honestly as he knew how. Because before I met Mazoga, I was alone, and I'd convinced myself that was simply how my life was meant to be. She looked at me on a road covered in blood and fear, and she saw something worth choosing, something I didn't even know I still had to offer. I don't have land or title or warrior's honors to lay before this council. All I have is the truth that I love her, that I would stand beside her against any danger this valley or these mountains could throw at us, and that I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that her choice was not a mistake, no matter how long that takes or how hard the road. Vashka's ancient eyes held his for a long moment, and then, slowly, she turned to consult with the other elders in a low murmur Elias could not follow. When she turned back, her expression had softened, just slightly, into something that was not quite approval but was, perhaps, respect. The clan has never before recognized a marriage to an outsider under full clan law, she said. But the clan has also never before had a member willing to risk everything she has built, rank and kinship both, rather than abandon a chosen mate. That farrier tells this council more than any speech could. She looked to Mazoga. Your marriage is recognized, Mazoga Gorehorn, under full clan law, binding and permanent, with all rights and protections owed to any clan union. Let no one, human or orc, question its legitimacy again in this council's presence. The relief that broke across Mazoga's face was so profound, so raw, that Elias felt his own throat tighten watching it. And when she turned to him after the elders dismissed the council, pulling him into an embrace fierce enough to lift him half off his feet, he laughed despite the tears standing unshed in his own eyes. "We did it," she murmured against his hair. "We are truly, fully bound now, Elias. No council, human or orc, can ever unmake this." "Good," he said, holding onto her as tightly as he could manage, "because I wasn't planning on letting you go anyway." That night, in the small hide tent given to them within the Gorehorn camp, with the fires burned low outside and the mountain wind singing against the tent's leather walls, Mazoga and Elias came together with a tenderness that felt, after everything they had survived to reach this point, like its own kind of victory. There was nothing hurried in it, nothing born of crisis or desperation, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of two people who had earned, through fire and iron and fierce declared honesty, the right to simply be together, unwatched, unquestioned, fully and completely each other's. Mazoga's hands, so capable of violence when the moment demanded it, moved over him with a gentleness that undid him more thoroughly than any battlefield rescue had. And Elias, in turn, learned the particular vulnerability of a woman who had spent her whole life being feared, finally allowing herself, in the quiet dark, to simply be held. Afterward, wrapped together beneath thick furs while the wind howled softly outside, Mazoga traced idle patterns against his chest and murmured, half asleep, that she had never once in all her years of leading warriors imagined she would find this particular kind of peace. And Elias, listening to her heartbeat slow beneath his ear, understood that whatever the mountains or the valley below still had waiting for them, they would face it now as something neither treaty nor council fire nor ancient clan law could ever again call into question. Fully, permanently, each other's. They stayed 3 more days in the high camp before beginning the long journey back down to Kest Hollow, and Elias found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely reluctant to leave. The Gorehorn elders, having recognized the marriage, seemed to relax considerably in his presence, several of the younger warriors even seeking him out to ask, with cautious curiosity, about the strange human custom of shoeing horses with iron nails, a practice their own clan had never much bothered with, preferring hardier mountain breeds that ran unshod. By the time they packed for the journey home, Elias had promised to return the following spring to teach a handful of interested warriors the basics of the farrier's trade. A small thing, perhaps, but one that felt to him like another quiet thread binding two worlds that had spent too long refusing to touch. The journey back down the mountain trails passed easily, the early snows holding off just long enough to let them reach Kest Hollow before the passes closed for the season, and the town that greeted them on their return felt, to Elias' relief, subtly but genuinely changed from the wary, divided place it had been on their wedding day. Word of the clan council's recognition had traveled ahead of them somehow, as news in a mountain valley always seemed to do, and Captain Ashford himself met them at the gate, offering this time a formal bow of respect that would have seemed unthinkable mere months before. "The council's decision has settled a great deal of argument in this valley," Ashford admitted, walking with them toward the Smithy district. "There are still those who grumble, of course. There always will be. But most of the town has come around to the notion that whatever else this marriage is, it is not the reckless scandal some feared it would be." He paused, then added with visible effort, "I owe you both an apology. I have been slow in giving properly. I doubted your honor, Mazoga, when I should have trusted the evidence of my own eyes. And I underestimated you, Elias, more times than I care to count. I hope you'll accept a garrison contract renewal at fair wages as a poor but sincere start toward making that right." "I'll accept fair wages," Elias said, allowing himself a small smile. "And I'd say that's a fine enough start, Captain." Life in Kest Hollow settled, over the weeks that followed, into a rhythm that felt, to Elias, almost impossibly peaceful compared to the chaos of the summer that had brought him and Mazoga together. He returned to his smithy work with renewed purpose, now serving as the primary farrier for both the garrison cavalry and, increasingly, for Gorehorn clan mounts brought down from the high camps for trade or treaty business. A small but steady stream of income that let them expand the little stone house near the stables with a proper second room and a wider hearth built to Mazoga's specifications, tall enough that she never had to duck beneath the low beams that plagued most human dwellings. Mazoga, for her part, continued her work maintaining the border truce, though with considerably less friction than before, the clan council's formal recognition of her marriage having settled, at last, the deepest doubts that had lingered about her loyalty. She still rode patrols, still mediated disputes, still occasionally had to remind some overconfident young warrior or suspicious garrison recruit exactly why her reputation as a war leader had never been exaggeration. But increasingly, her role shifted from enforcer of a fragile truce toward something more like steward of a genuine, if still imperfect, peace. A transition that suited her, Elias thought, watching her laugh more easily, sleep more soundly, carry herself through the market square with a lightness he had not seen in her during those tense first weeks of their marriage. The first true test of that peace's durability came, fittingly, at the Autumn Harvest Festival, the first such gathering in Kest Hollow's history to formally include representatives from the Gorehorn clan camps as invited guests, rather than wary observers kept at a careful distance. The town square filled with stalls selling preserved fruit and mountain wool, musicians from both human and orc traditions competing good-naturedly for the crowd's attention, and children from both peoples, less burdened by old grievances than their elders, chasing each other through the crowd with a freedom that made something in Elias' chest ache with quiet hope for whatever future this valley might yet build. Mazoga, dressed for the occasion in a set of fitted formal leathers dyed a deep autumn russet, the closest she owned to festival attire, stood beside Elias near the town well, watching the celebration with an expression of cautious wonder. "I did not think I would live to see this," she admitted quietly. "Orc and human children playing the same game in the same square, with no one calling out for their parents to separate them." "Neither did I," Elias said. "Not until I met a war leader with a taste for dramatic gestures and a habit of throwing wedding bouquets like she meant to put someone's eye out." Mazoga laughed, that same delighted bark of sound he had come to treasure more than almost any other, and elbowed him gently in the ribs. "That bouquet needed throwing. I do not regret a single flower lost to that river." "Neither do I," Elias said, and meant it fully, because whatever that river had carried away that morning, doubt and grievance and the fear of an impossible future, it had left behind, in its place, exactly the life he had never quite let himself hope for. Winter arrived in earnest not long after the harvest festival, closing the high mountain passes and settling Kest Hollow into the quieter rhythms of the cold season, when trade slowed and the garrison's patrols shrank to careful, essential routes rather than the wider-ranging duties of summer and autumn. It was, in its way, the first truly peaceful stretch of time Elias and Mazoga had known together since their sudden, crisis-born marriage, and they spent it settling more deeply into the shared life they had fought so hard to earn. There were still small frictions, the ordinary kind that came with any two strong-willed people learning to share a life, disagreements over how best to store the winter grain, a memorable argument over Mazoga's insistence on keeping a particularly foul-tempered mountain goat as a pet, despite its habit of eating Elia's spare leather aprons. But these were the frictions of an ordinary marriage, hard-won and precious precisely because they were ordinary, unburdened by treaty councils or clan elders or raiders on the mountain road, and Elias found himself, more than once through that quiet winter, simply sitting by the hearth watching Mazoga mend a torn strap or sharpen a blade by firelight, overwhelmed by a contentment so complete it sometimes ached. One evening in late winter, with snow drifted thick against the shutters and the fire burning low, Mazoga set aside the blade she had been sharpening and looked at Elias with an expression he had come to recognize as the precursor to something important. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the bouquet." "The bouquet," Elias repeated, amused. "It has been quite some time since our wedding day, Mazoga." "I know, but I have been thinking about what it meant and what it still means, and I find I want to tell you plainly, in case I have never said it plainly enough." She reached across the small distance between them and took his hand, turning it over in hers the way she so often did, as though the shape of his palm still fascinated her. "That morning, I released every doubt I carried, every fear that this marriage was some reckless mistake born of a single desperate moment in a council hall. I have not since that day felt a single flicker of that doubt return, not during the raid, not during the council fire in the high camp. Not once in all the months since have I wondered whether I chose wrongly." She lifted his hand and pressed it against her chest, over the steady, strong beat of her heart. "I want you to know that certainty, Elias, as plainly as I know it myself. You are not a mistake I am still waiting to correct. You are the truest choice I have ever made, and I intend to go on choosing you every single day, for as long as this life allows us." Elias felt his own eyes sting, unexpected and overwhelming, and he pulled her close, burying his face against her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that had, somewhere in the past months, become simply the smell of home. "I choose you too," he said, voice rough. "Every day, Mazoga. I meant it on that riverbank, and I mean it more now than I did then, because now I actually know what I'm choosing. Not just a fierce war leader who saved my life on a mountain road. You. All of you. The woman who argues with me about a goat and mends her own armor by firelight and still, somehow, looks at me like I'm the most remarkable thing she's ever seen." "You are," Mazoga murmured against his hair. "Remarkable, I mean. You have always been, Elias Bailey, even when you did not believe it of yourself. I simply had the good sense to notice first." Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady against the shuttered windows, and the mountain wind that had once carried raiders and rumor and the shattered pieces of an old, fragile truce now carried only the quiet sounds of a peaceful winter night, settling over a valley slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely learning to heal. Spring came late to the high mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, melting the deep snow from the passes and coaxing the first green shoots up through the thawing terraced fields, it brought with it the fulfillment of a promise made in a hide tent among the Gorehorn clan's high camps the previous autumn. Elias made the journey up the mountain trails again, this time with a proper set of farrier's tools packed carefully in saddlebags, to spend a full week teaching a small group of curious young orc warriors the patient, careful art of shoeing a horse, work that required trust between animal and handler in equal measure to skill, and which, by the end of that week, had earned him a grudging but genuine respect from warriors who had, less than a year before, viewed any human presence in their camp with deep suspicion. Mazoga rode with him for that journey, not out of any necessity but simply because, as she put it, she saw no reason to be parted from her husband for a full week when she could just as easily spend that week watching him work, an excuse Elias suspected had less to do with practicality, and more to do with the fact that she genuinely, openly enjoyed his company, a fact that still, some mornings, filled him with a quiet disbelief he suspected might never entirely fade. It was during that same visit to the high camp that Elias finally stood once more before the riverbank far below Kest Hollow, this time not the mountain river near the town, but a smaller, gentler tributary that ran through a quiet meadow near the Gorehorn camp, where wildflowers had begun pushing up through the thawing earth in scattered clusters of white and yellow. Mazoga found him there one evening, sitting on a flat stone near the water's edge, watching the current carry small clusters of fallen petals downstream. "You are thinking of our wedding," she said, settling beside him without needing to be told, the way she so often seemed to simply understand him without explanation. "I am," he admitted. "It's strange. A year ago, almost to this season, I was a farrier nobody much noticed, and you were a war leader I'd only ever heard about in rumor. Now look at us." "Now look at us," Mazoga agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder, a gesture of casual, easy affection that would have seemed impossible from the fierce, guarded woman he'd first met on that mountain road. "Do you regret any of it? The raid, the council fires, the doubt we had to fight through to reach this quiet meadow?" Elias considered the question seriously, watching the water carry another small cluster of petals downstream, out of sight around a gentle bend. "No," he said finally. "Not one moment of it. Even the hard parts led here to this. To you, choosing me every single day, exactly like you promised. I wouldn't trade a single difficult day for a version of our life that skipped past any of it." Mazoga lifted her head and looked at him, her golden eyes warm in the fading evening light, and something in her expression carried the same fierce, open tenderness she had shown him that morning by the river below Kest Hollow, throwing her bouquet into the current and reaching for his hand instead. "Neither would I," she said. "Every hard road led me to you, Elias Bailey. I would walk every mile of it again gladly to arrive at exactly this moment." She kissed him there by the quiet mountain stream, unhurried and certain, and around them the meadow grew gently dark as the last light faded from the peaks above, and somewhere downstream, unseen, the scattered white petals continued their long journey toward the lowlands, carrying with them, as they had once before, the last quiet remnants of every doubt either of them had ever carried, leaving behind only the life they had built together, hard-won and entirely, unshakably their own. They stayed in the meadow until the stars came out fully overhead, bright and countless in the clear mountain air, and when they finally rose to walk back to the camp together, Mazoga's hand found Elias exactly the way it had that first night in the great hall, exactly the way it had on the riverbank, exactly the way it would, Elias knew now with complete and settled certainty, for every single day of the long life they intended to build together, one season at a time, one quiet evening at a time. Chosen and rechosen, again and again, for as long as the mountains stood and the rivers ran, and the valley below Kest Hollow remembered the story of the orc bride who threw her bouquet into the river and reached for a farrier's hand instead, and never once looked back.